Caroline. Thank you very much for the very wonderful invitation. It's a real pleasure to be back at Roehampton. I miss you guys, and you know, it would be great if we could be doing this in person, but next time perhaps. So I'll just brief introductions. I can't remember if there was an order, but I'm going to play them: Golden Gate, then Sculptures of London, which is the order that, not that they were made in, but it is the order that they were published in. So Golden Gate is a kind of video essay of found footage of movies about Golden Gate Bridge, and kind of trying to think of it as a sentient object, perhaps, that is ushering in new worlds. So I'm going to introduce both films at once, and then I'll play them back to back. And Sculptures of London is a much more kind of personal, original footage film I would like to talk about later, but it basically is trying to create a narrative or an intellectual narrative, perhaps, out of the Sculptures of London, which I spent a few months filming with my cinematographer, Tom Main. He's not my cinematographer, but a cinematographer that I regularly work with called Tom Main, back in 2017, and which has a voiceover by a German actor called Lisa Schwärm, and we can talk about sort of those things as well. So I'll play them back to back. I hope that they are enjoyable, and I look forward to discussing everything with Mike and discussing things with the rest of you and catching up a little bit more generally later on. I hope you're all well. I'll share the screen now.
Welcome back, everyone. We're now 4:31. We have our key players in our conversation have arrived back for our session. So I'm going to get this off to a good start. So I want to thank William for screening of his films. For anyone new to just joined us, I'm Stacey Abbott. I'm one of the co-directors of the Centre for Research in Film and Audiovisual Cultures, along with Professor Caroline Bainbridge, who will be chairing the session. But I am here to just again welcome you to this session in conversation session that we're running today as part of our research series. I would just like to do a little bit of housekeeping, which is just to remind people that during the conversation, this session will begin with our conversation, and then there will be space for questions at the end, towards the end. So if I can ask people to keep their mics muted and cameras off for the recording. We'll be recording the in-conversation session. If you have questions, do feel free to put them in the chat, and we will ensure that we get to your questions towards the end. Or of course, when we get to the question portion, do feel free to use the raise hand icon, and we will get to your question as quickly as we can. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Caroline Bainbridge to welcome our two guests. So I'm going to hand over to Cara.
Thanks so much, Stacey, and welcome again to everybody. Welcome if you're just joining us for the In Conversation following the screening of Dr. William Brown's wonderful two essay films, Golden Gate Bridge and Sculptures of London. It's a very special moment for us to welcome William back to Roehampton after his unanticipated departure in the summer last year. So a very warm welcome back to you, William. It's an absolute honour and delight to have you back amongst us. For those of you who are not aware of William's work, I suggest that you might make prompt effort to correct that as soon as possible, as his insightful work around cinema is some of the most thought-provoking I've encountered during the course of my career. William is currently an independent scholar. He's also continuing in his relationship with Roehampton in the role of Honorary Fellow for the School of Arts. And he is the author of many amazing books, including The Squid Cinema from Hell, The Emergence of Cthulumedia, which he co-authored with David Fleming, Non-Cinema, Supercinema, and he is also the maker of various films, including En Attendant Godard, Selfie, well, Selfie without the French intonation, I suppose, Random Access Memory, and This is Cinema. And we are also equally delighted to have our very own Professor Michael Witt, who, as many of you know, is similarly expert in the techniques, strategies, and the development of our understanding in the context of film studies around audiovisual media and audiovisual filmmaking in particular. Mike is Professor of Cinema here at University of Roehampton and a long-standing and much valued colleague. He is also very well known for his outstanding expertise in the history, theory, and practice of the audiovisual essay, and on the work of the film director Jean-Luc Godard. He is the author of Jean-Luc Godard, Cinema Historian, and this book won the 2014 Limina Award for the Best International Film Studies book, which speaks volumes. Mike is also the co-editor of For Ever Godard, Jean-Luc Godard Documents, and the French Cinema book, amongst other projects. He's also, as I'm sure you're already aware, curated many film seasons for institutions such as Tate Modern, the Ciné-Lumière and BFI Southbank, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you both in conversation around the notion of essay film, and in particular these two wonderful works that you've given. I was struck, William, by the timeliness of Sculptures of London, given all that's been happening certainly around the UK over the past 6 to 8 months since the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in particular, and thinking about how prescient your work was. I think you made the film in, was it 2017, 2018? Memory serves correctly.
17.
Yeah. And of course, the iconography of Golden Gate Bridge, and I'm just struck, you know, my immediate kind of response to your encyclopedic knowledge of cinema and the brilliant in-depth research that it underpins such a work is mind-boggling. So I want to take a moment just to congratulate you on the achievements here. But I'm not going to say too much now. I will hand over to you and Mike to begin your conversation. And just to reiterate, if you could make sure that the mic is off for the in conversation segment, we'll probably go for around 40-45 minutes. And then if you want to join for the more open Q&A section, please feel free to put your video back on and to signal using either a waving hand in the face of the Zoom camera or your raise hand function. Then we'll come to you as soon as possible. And as Stacey has already said, feel free to pop questions in the chat too. I'll mute myself now and hand over to you and Mike. William, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, both Stacey and Caro. And yeah, I'd just like to extend, you know, my greetings to William too, over in Canada. It is it's lovely to sort of be in touch and to have this opportunity to see your work, but also to discuss it. I kind of thought maybe just picking up on something that Caro said, maybe we could start with the kind of multifaceted nature of your work, because it seems to me that probably not everyone here is aware of the sheer kind of range of modes and media that you're working in. So besides kind of just publishing articles, books, editorial activities, writing film scripts, you're also making a wide range of different types of audiovisual work. And I think we've seen two, you know, quite kind of contrasting examples there, which are clearly very different, although they have certain kind of commonalities. But also beyond your short films and your short essay films, you've made a significant number of low budget feature films. So I just wondered if we could start, if you could just say something about the kind of diversity of your interests, and perhaps also the relationship between your scholarly or more academic activities and your more non-scholarly outputs. And if you do kind of have a clear distinction between them. I kind of wonder, when you start a project, do you kind of just do it because you want to do it, and then kind of wonder where it leads to, and then kind of place it afterwards, or do you have a kind of distinction in your mind? Yeah, so maybe if we could just start with that.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you also to Stacey and Cara again for the wonderful words and invitation. It's tradition where I am to say that I'm talking to you from the unceded and occupied lands of the Musqueam peoples, and that is where I'm talking from today. So I should acknowledge that it's by virtue of being in such a place that I'm able to be here. In answer to this very, very good question, Mike, which is one that I think I wrangle with the whole time, and I feel I've sort of avoided therapy quite a lot in my life, which has changed recently. I've started seeing a therapist. I needed to go into therapy, but I suppose the reason why I kind of start with this sort of probably sort of weird sense of sharing is that I find it quite hard to reflect critically, even though I've spent years asking students to do just that on their creative work. I'm not sure where a lot of it comes from in terms of the compulsion to do it, and I'm not wholly sure what a lot of it is necessarily trying to say. I probably do try to retrofit things as you kind of suggest, but there's something kind of whimsical about the whole endeavor, and I don't mean to kind of belittle it, but I mean to say, you know, I had an idea about making a film about the sculptures of London. I wanted to see where it would go, and I think I just started doing it and persuaded poor old Tom Main, who, you know, came with me all around London to shoot all of these things in little snippets, sort of like a couple of hours here. We'd go to, you know, whichever part of London where we could find a few sculptures together, and then we'd wait a couple of weeks, then we'd have a full day and so on. You know, that came, I didn't really know where with that project we were going. I sort of had a loose idea, I guess. I wanted there to be a story, but the story, and it's not like a ripping yarn. It's just a kind of, like I said in before the film, a kind of an intellectual reading, I guess, of the sculptures of London. You know, where that came from, that was sort of something that was shaped in the kind of in the making, and then subsequent to shooting, and in the kind of editing and the writing, I guess, of the piece. So, and I sort of, I think in some ways I deliberately caught something like kind of non-academic ideas. I kind of try to be as instinctive, for want of a better word, as possible with filmmaking, rather than to set myself some specifically academic principles. I can often shoot according to a set of principles, particularly timeframes. I just tend to find condensing things helps to get things done, and I get very frustrated if I'm not doing stuff. I get very kind of like antsy, I guess. So you know, it's not that I don't set myself boundaries and rules, but I actually try not to be academic for the main part with a bunch of the work that I do. I'd say that is slightly contradicted when I get to more essayistic, and therefore in some senses stuff that's veering towards the academic, which the sculptures piece might be an example of. But I have a film about selfies and selfie culture called Selfie, or Selfie, as Caro said earlier, which you know, I think is actually quite an academic piece, and it's not alone. There's another one called Random Access Memory, which is quite an academic piece about kind of very personal experiences. So I suppose I'm trying to, if there is something academic, I'm trying to sort of trouble what is academic, and if there is something that's not very academic, maybe I try and make it a bit academic in some ways. So and I think that perhaps is as close as I can get to reflecting my own tensions and my own sort of tendency to try to intellectualize things. But to talk about these two pieces in particular, you know, I think Golden Gate is a piece that is clearly academic. It's published in an academic journal, but I'm trying to get away from certain academic tendencies in the more typical range of what video essays look like. And Sculptures of London, I think, could be very academic, but oddly isn't. I can probably get off my chest sort of straight away some of the one of the peer reviews, and it's published peer review that I had for the piece, which kind of lamented that it was a kind of like an ahistorical piece that wasn't institutionally funded, and it didn't go into kind of like how and why the sculptures specifically were in the places that they are, and so on and so forth. But that wasn't, I mean, and I appreciate that. Basically, the kind of feedback said, why didn't you make a film that Laura Mulvey would have made? Which I wish in some ways that I could, but it was kind of like, I get it, but it wasn't the film that I was setting out to make. I wanted to make something that, you know, was probably academic to a degree, but just which had something very simple, at least in my head, kind of something very simple about it, which was just kind of like, well, look, what when we put all these together and do a bit of totting up, you know, what is it that we're being told? Well, how does this reflect the space? What does it say about the space that we live in, or that I used to live in, and that many of you currently live in? I should also add, it's great to see so many former colleagues, some former students, and also people from other institutions and from around the globe at this talk, and I appreciate very much everyone being there.
Thank you very much. There are probably one or two things we can pick up on in what you've just said, but I'd like to just take a step back and just sort of think about some of your kind of models and guides, because in relation to the two films that we've just seen, but also to Random Access Memory, which I have seen, and also to St Mary Magdalene's Home Movies, as also to Clem, and those latter two are both published in the online journal In Transition. It seems to me that there are three key figures who kind of recur, and sometimes you cite their work, either their words or their images or both, directly. And I'd just like to suggest a kind of scheme, and then see what you think about it. The first person would be Vada, and Vada, whose work you cite explicitly in your presentation of Sculptures of London, notably her sculpture film, Les Dites Cariatides. And it seems to me that Vada we might discuss particularly in relation to her theory and practice of gleaning. So this kind of accumulation, this collecting of kind of debris and then combining it. The other is Chris Marker, who we've heard cited in Golden Gate, and perhaps particularly for his exploration of the relationship between voice and image. Not only, but I just think that's one sort of key area where he contributed enormously to the development of the essay film. And then thirdly, Godard, for his advocacy of the idea of thinking with one's hands. And I'm thinking particularly in the kind of exploratory use of found footage and making archive material speak through montage. So if one takes those kind of three poles, if you like, it seems to me that in relation to the approaches and the formal strategies that you've adopted in Sculptures of London and Golden Gate in particular, that we might situate Sculptures of London through reference to Vada and Marker, and Golden Gate more through reference to Godard and that kind of exploratory sort of hands-on editing. I just wondered if, you know, if you could say something maybe about those three, but also others who may be important to you that I haven't mentioned.
Very good. I mean, and I think those three figures, and Marker does also get a mention with René in Sculptures of London. And I've made a film that's kind of about China, which is sort of quite explicitly a kind of an extended attempt at a Chris Marker film, and which was initiated the day that Chris Marker died. I'd had sat on 50 plus hours of footage that I'd shot in China in 2006. And I hadn't known quite what to do with it. I was supposed to be making a kind of an industrial film with it, and I couldn't be bothered. I couldn't bring myself to make a kind of like a kind of a corporate film with this footage. So, but then the day that Chris Marker died, I watched Sans Soleil again, and it kind of just everything fell into place. I knew what I wanted to do with this footage finally. So, I mean, for me, these are all aspirational figures, and I kind of just reading Rick Warner's book on Godard and the essay film, which deals with all three really, but Godard's the kind of primary point of focus. You know, helps me to understand distinctions between these filmmakers that I probably don't. I see, but I think if I were to think about my kind of primary / primal response to them, I'm much more about what they share or what I share with them, as opposed to the distinctions between them. So they kind of become an amorphous whole with other filmmakers, but it's just kind of like, oh, this is kind of what cinema is saying and what I aspire to, rather than specifically this from this person, specifically that from that person. So, you know, I think for me, well, to go with voice and image, and actually thinking with one's hands, I think to start with this sort of Godard thing, it struck me, I love and I hate the use of voice in my films. I know I've had long conversations anyway with and heard feedback from various people, including some present, you know, about probably an overuse of voice in some of my work, which I can get, and I've been trying to move away from that in various different ways, and in particular to move away from my voice. But thinking about it just now, I wonder that it's not so much the voice that I'm interested in, it's actually that it's typing, and maybe I should be thinking about typing, because for me, I find I can talk, but I find typing is probably thinking with my hands after a certain sense. So for me, the text, which ends up being spoken, probably comes out of a kind of thinking with the hands, which is typing and working on the keyboard there, and you know, perhaps in a kind of musical fashion. And I don't think that that's dissimilar in some ways, because it's the same keyboard that I'll be using generally for editing as well. And they often have a lot of the same shortcuts, and we use the same language for cutting and pasting and so on and so forth for thinking about how we kind of rearrange images. So for me, I think, yeah, maybe there is a kind of way in which I'm thinking with my hands when I'm making this work. But and that oddly does connect in some ways to my theoretical engagements with cephalopods and the idea of tactility as thought, which is not necessarily explicitly drawn out, but which is definitely in there as kind of I think part of the attraction towards thinking about squids and octopuses is this tactility. That we don't call them hands, but they have arms and legs and tentacles which are at work there, and they're probably quite good thieves or purloiners and gleaners. I mean, I think with regard to kind of voice, then I'm always trying, and I think actually it wasn't shown today, but since it's been mentioned, the film I made called Random Access Memory is perhaps for me so far the best example of, if I use the voice, I kind of want the voice to be doing its own thing and the image does its own thing. And sometimes they kind of come together and sometimes they drift apart, and for there to be almost two stories going on. And even if it might seem sometimes, because of how we watch films, that the voice is over determining what we're supposed to be getting out of the images, in my mind, and in sort of with regard to a kind of an ideal spectator, I suppose I'm hoping or imagining that excuse me, that actually you could kind of turn off the image track and listen to the voice, or turn off the soundtrack and watch the images, and you would have two different films. and just to have them do their own thing, but here they are simultaneously. So I think I'm not trying, I'm often not really trying to have the voice illustrate or tell us of what we're supposed to be thinking about the images. Now I may fail in that, and or at least I may fail for a lot of people in that endeavor, but that's, I think, definitely what I'm trying to do. And then gleaning, yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm a kind of hoarder. I can't throw away books. I can't throw away things that I printed out. I do download and keep films, not to the extent that I know a lot of people do, but you know, I'm definitely trying to draw things together. I mean, I suppose I feel like I'm working towards a kind of a mega project at some point, which will be a kind of grand détournement in a sort of a kind of big video essay that I don't know quite what it'll be about. I thought I had a moment yesterday when I thought it would be about guillotine, last year when I thought it would be about guillotine culture and the kind of shift from a literary to an audiovisual society. And I think that that is kind of what I want it to be about, but I still don't know how it's gonna be, but I feel like I am gathering ideas, so gleaning, I think, in some senses. Although it sort of strikes me that's sort of more of a Markerian practice to kind of just keep, you know, accruing footage, original and found. Even though, you know, and Varda, you know, I think what I like most about Varda, and Marker and Godard in their own ways, but Varda, I think, most transparently, is her ability to engage with other people. I think that's what I love most about her work, is the stage dialogues between her and others, which Godard and Marker can be read in that way, but I don't think it's there in the same sort of overt fashion. I think probably, and I think I'm always aspiring towards that Varda-like presence of others, although it may sound from these two examples, but I suppose I'm thinking about my fictional work and how that plays out, and how we have a script, but it's kind of very loose, and we'll go with what we find along the way and change things depending on what we encounter. You know, that perhaps is a little bit more, it's heading towards kind of Varda territory. And so she's, you know, almost an impossible figure for me. Somehow I can't quite get to being the kind of filmmaker that I'd like to be, but definitely aspiring towards it.
Well, maybe just talking about Sculptures of London and then sort of thinking about the voiceover, it strikes me that it shifts. So you move, or the film moves between I and we. It starts off talking about, you know, making these sculptures make me feel alone and is insignificant. But then there's increasingly, I think, over the course of the film, this use of we, and of course it's delivered in this accented female voice. And you gave the name of the actor earlier, it was Lisa Schwalm. And it struck me that together these things chimed closely with the film's concern for community, what you were sort of referring to, you were evoking just now, but also with its critique of the underrepresentation of women in London statuary. So I wonder if you just might say something about the kind of conception and the texture and the mode of address in the voiceover.
Well, I decided early on that I didn't want to voice the film, and I wanted, this is 2017, someone European specifically to be voicing the film, to be looking at London, hopefully with something like an outsider's perspective. And then when Lisa and I met to do the voiceover, I specifically asked her to try to sound a little bit like she was struggling with the language, which also, given some of the vocabulary that I very cruelly asked her to read, you know, kind of in some senses happened anyway. And I don't mean that as a critique of anything other than just sort of mouth shapes and musculature and what we're used to sort of saying and so on. But some of the words were difficult, but I wanted to, work with that rather than not. I think the voice, we booked a sound recording studio for the day, and then it was shut when we got there, and for whatever reason there'd been no record and we couldn't get access to it. So we had to kind of, well, I suppose you didn't have to, but I went with working in actually my office in Roehampton back then to do the voice, which is not padded and has a kind of it feels like it's spoken from in a box. But again, for better or for worse, I feel like there was something about that which I was okay with for the film. It sort of undermines the kind of authoritative voice of God from nowhere. It sounds like it's coming from somewhere, perhaps the inside of a spaceship or something. So I was definitely trying to get towards offering the perspective of someone not from the UK, preferably European, but who is also perhaps, not speaking their first language, and even to whom this language was quite alien in some ways. And Lissa's spoken English is perfect, flawless, and she's been in other of my films for you to, if anyone wants to check out how good her English is. So it is very much a kind of vocal performance. And I think given this sort of the story that these sculptures seem to be saying, I think it did seem apt to me for the voice to be coming from a female figure. Now, I wrote it, and I think that part of, therefore, the way in which productively to work with, how I'm not, the possibility of ventriloquizing basically is indeed to kind of have this sort of slightly stilted, at times, quite difficult pronunciation of these things. So even if I don't stage a kind of a revolt where, which could be a fun version of the film where Lissa's kind of like, what is this? I don't want to say these words, etc., etc. We kind of actually think through the politics of the text and the reading of the text. Hopefully in some ways it's kind of there on a kind of low level to think about, to sort of at work, I guess, in the film.
Sculptures, or the sculptures film, it reminded me a little bit of Barthes and Barthes' mythologies, and it struck me the film is, in a way, it's a kind of audiovisual sort of addition or extension of that kind of demythologizing project, where it takes the whole of London sculptures as a corpus with the aim of revealing the kind of deeply reactionary patriarchal ideology underpinning them. It reminded me, in a sense, it struck me that there's a kind of an extension in the film of your earlier exploration of the gendering of public space in Mary Maudlin's home movies. So, it strikes me that, which is working in for those of you who haven't seen it, it's essentially a found footage essay, so much closer to Golden Gate than it is to Sculptures of London. But it seems to me that you're kind of circling, you're coming back to some key ideas. In Sculptures of London, I was struck that despite your findings being pretty depressing, so particularly in relation to the representation of women and people of colour, and again, I would also relate this to Golden Gate. Actually, your narrative ends on a somewhat optimistic note. It kind of you're suggesting that this move towards abstraction, or from what you'd call the sort of shift from statues to sculpture and from bronze to stone, marks a kind of shift towards a warmer, more open, potentially a more inclusive relationship between the city and its inhabitants, between people and the world. So I just kind of wonder if you could just say, I mean, is that an accurate kind of summary of the kind of movement of the film? And I just wonder if you could say something about that kind of optimistic, forward-looking dimension of the film?
That's very good. I like this. If we start with Golden Gate, I think the thesis, without wishing to sort of try to pinpoint it too much, is the world as we know it. So by which I mean, I guess, the world of white patriarchal masculinity, capital. It goes by many names, and they don't always precisely overlap, but this world, or these worlds, are coming to an end. I think that this idea of the Golden Gate Bridge being the end of the Western imaginary, the end of the Western imagination. This is why it is this site for the end of life, as well as the beginning of life. These sort of new life forms that come through, or be they robots that are sentient, aliens, apes that have evolved to think for themselves, posits the continuation of life. I mean, I think there's a sort of, and this is something that's absent in the film, and I think I would write about it differently, and I'd probably try to get it across differently if I were to make the film again today, is a couple of things. Firstly, that there is, I think there is some sort of hope, although these films arguably are problematic in that they are about the advent. So let me put it this way: in the white Western imaginary, the Golden Gate Bridge is kind of like the end of the world. It's the furthest point that you can get to, and beyond that, there's the unknown, or a new world, or death. I think that but what I didn't get, and which I've got from watching a few more San Francisco and specifically Golden Gate films, is that in the Asian American imagination, the Golden Gate Bridge is the point of entry into the United States. And actually we see this staged in various different films, from Wayne Wang's Chan is Missing through to, now the name escapes me, what's the musical from the kind of 60s that's all set in San Francisco about Asian American. The name will come back to me. Anyway, actually this kind of point of entry, if we read this sort of point of exit, and how it is also a point of entry for these sort of alien others, there is in some ways a kind of a repetition of ideas that have been around in film for a long time. James Sneed writes about King Kong as basically being a kind of an ersatz African American, and how many monsters have this kind of racial sort of substitution that goes on in science fiction and fantasy and other cinemas. And I think that there is this kind of way in which that perhaps the future that we're thinking about is a kind of a post-colonial, decolonized future that is about emergence, not of kind of artificial life or aliens, but which is about, in some senses, the emancipation of white, and I guess particularly white America, but the white West's racial others. And I wonder that kind of now, and it is kind of there in the film, because there's two Bollywood movies that are in there. My Name is Khan, where Shah Rukh Khan plays an autistic character, which I kind of link sonically to the character of Khan from the Star Trek films, to sort of suggest that there is this perhaps post-colonial entity or identity that can emerge, and that is the future. And that's there in the final shots of the film, just as the end credits begin, which are taken from another Bollywood film called Happy, ironically enough called Happy Ending, and in which we see these, again, kind of post-colonial diasporic figures engaging in admittedly a kind of very heteronormative in romance in front of the Golden Gate, but all the same there's something there that's about that. So I think in some ways I would sort of bring forward, if I did it again, the racial components to these things, and think about how this point of exit is only the point of exit from a certain perspective, i.e. the kind of settler colonial perspective, and that given and that even these kind of like artificial intelligences and monsters and aliens therefore are kind of are only monsters and aliens from this settler colonial perspective as well, and actually from their own perspective, these would be new life forms to celebrate. So there is something upbeat, but I still think it can't help but become a little bit ensnared in the cultures that produce, and in which I also am kind of immersed, these images. And then with regard to kind of sculptures, I think, yeah, I think I'm trying to be upbeat and say that there is perhaps a shift away. But for me, what would be the ultimate kind of endpoint would be a sort of a dissolution of sculpture as such in some ways. There are artists, of course, who are regularly working with soft materials that are neither stone nor bronze, and whose notion of the sculpture is not one of long-standing, if not permanent, presence and existence, but which is sort of much more temporary, and which therefore evolves and becomes itself. But we don't see much of that in London. We haven't sort of got to that point where, in effect, we move away from the hardness even of stone and petrification and into the softness of that which, you know, will rot or fall apart. But you know, maybe there will be a kind of a wave of that, and again, that would tie in with the kind of soft mollusk kind of thinking that is sort of there in the cephalopodic thought. So there is this kind of conceptual continuity perhaps at work there.
So I've been reading your book. I haven't finished it, but I am enjoying it enormously. And so just to kind of pick up on some of these cephalopodic themes. I mean, the one thing that occurred to me is, or one thing that struck me reading your book is how attentive you are to language, and David Fleming, we should add, to metaphor, to the metaphoricity of language, but also the kind of the potential of new metaphors, and in particular in this instance media as cephalopods, to open up new ways of thinking and seeing. Now, etymologically, as you of course know, metaphor comes from the Latin and Greek to transfer or to carry over. And so it struck me that your choice of the bridge in the film is not innocent in this context, or at least could be read as quite productive, since without too great a leap of the imagination, the bridge is a metaphor of metaphor. It's a metaphor for the metaphorical process. And so as such, it's a particularly fertile kind of object of analysis in relation to your broader project on the potential of opening up new ways of thinking through metaphor. So I just wondered if that was kind of on your mind, because it's not something, I mean, that's kind of over and beyond, if you like, the aspects of the bridge that you've already alluded to in relation to the kind of end point of the West, or the kind of meeting point of the desert and the sea and so
on. I think that's great. I think, yeah, you know, I think that in the language of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, we live by metaphors. I think I was talking about Arrival, the film, on a podcast recently, so I feel like which figures relatively prominently in the Squid Cinema book, and a lot of these ideas come up. I also think of Arrival, incidentally, as being a film that is about the notion of the handbook, and the handbook, I think, is perhaps maybe one way for us to think about cinema, or the manual. And so that takes us back to kind of thinking with one's hands and so on. That's not in the Squid Cinema book, but it's something that I just thought watching Arrival recently. And in Arrival, they explore, at least as a kind of sub-theme of the film, what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is simply put, the language that we speak is what will shape our thoughts. And you know, if we only speak a certain language, then we can only have certain thoughts. If we learn more languages, then it will expand the kinds of thoughts that we can have. And I think in some ways, the aim is, and perhaps this would be a kind of a Deleuzian language to kind of deterritorialize thought or to unwire the mental associations that we make in the brain. Donald Hebb, the neuroscientist, said, you know, what fires together wires together, that in effect our thought patterns become quite hardened, you know, through repetition, and we end up making similar associations. And this doesn't seem to be too far from thinking about, you know, how cinema is arguably a tool for you know, indoctrination and so on, and ideas that are kind of widely circulated for a long time, including in the work of someone like Bifo Berardi, who Michael Goddard has translated, and so on and so forth. And I see he has a question which we can come back to, but you know, I think that there is a hope to be doing that kind of work, and I don't think that the Golden Gate Bridge exists just as a bridge. I think not only does my use of it hopefully convey, you know, isn't just metaphorical. I mean, there's something sort of quite literal about these things. I suppose in relation to this Squid Cinema book, which has all sorts of kind of slightly crazy ideas floating around in it, the question is kind of how seriously should we take it? I guess hopefully it's coming up a lot in the reader's mind, and the question is of, you know, how much do we mean this? And the answer is kind of like a lot, or yeah, we mean all of it, but also we don't. So there's something about humor, I think, to be thought about in relation to these things, and the role that humor might play in changing the way that we think about things. But you know, I suppose the same is true. And the Golden Gate is not just a bridge; it is also shaping the way that we think and feel. And the sculptures in London are not just innocent objects; they are, you know, even if we pass them by every day and don't pay any attention to them, they're still shaping the way that we think and feel about them. So it's not just about the kind of the verbal language that we speak, or do I speak English or do I speak French, and how does that shape how I think and feel about things. It's also the language of the space in which we exist, and the language of the rhythms with which we exist. And you know, even if these are not languages per se from a sort of philosophical perspective, they're still having similar kind of effects. They still have this kind of like real / metaphorical function, or they still are working in this zone, for want of a marker kind of esque term, you know, where they're not just objects and they're not just metaphors. They're real, you know, and this is our reality. So we need to rethink that, and we can do that by reorganizing that space and rearranging it and bringing all of the sculptures together. Oh, when I see all of these sculptures, 300 one after the other, I get a sense of kind of like how they're actually functioning on this kind of slow level. You know, when I see 3 a day or 2 a day, but what accumulates to be several hundred over a couple of years. When I watch these movies, and even when I see the Golden Gate Bridge itself, you know, it's also shaping my thoughts and so on. So I think it is working towards trying to have that kind of metaphorical methodology at work. I like it a lot. I mean, I do also think Golden Gate is also about falling in some ways, very obviously, but I think that the idea of cadere, to fall, and the motorcade as a kind of falling of cars through to then this kind of cascade of human beings is also kind of another kind of visual, verbal metaphor that's kind of going on there.
Thank you. I'm kind of conscious of time. I just wonder if I might just ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to everybody. And it really, I mean, just sort of picking up on the Vachel Lindsay, who you quote towards the several times towards the beginning of Golden Gate. It seems to me that one of the things that your film is doing is advocating for the possibility of a rejuvenated, properly experimental form of audiovisual film philosophy in this film, and you're evoking Lindsay, who was obviously writing, you know, prior to sound, prior to the construction of the bridge. And there's a quote that I jotted down where that you use in the film, this idea of a higher form of film seeing, which I like very much. And I just kind of wondered if you were to pursue, or if one were to pursue, this kind of exploratory, experimental, cephalopodic form of audiovisual film philosophy, what it might look like. And in particular, I suppose I was thinking of kind of soft, translucent forms such as superimposition, which you don't use. So I just sort of wondered if there was, you know, if there is scope for you to pursue that. Well, I'm sure there is, but you know, what it might kind of, what it might look like.
Very good. I'm not uninterested in superimposition, and it does come up. I mean, there's a whole kind of 3 to 4 minute sequence of superimposition in a film I did called The Benefit of Doubt, and I definitely am. It's not outside of my kind of thinking. I think with regard to kind of video essay work with found footage, yeah, it's also, yeah, I'd like to do it, but how to make a soft kind of image? It's a good question. I mean, for me, I think I'm more instinctively often wondering about how to get rid of the frame. In my kind of theoretical writings, I wonder that 3D is a way of doing this, and that Godard is thinking in that fashion in his 3D work, and that's in a book called Non-Cinema. But actually, I'm kind of, I want to kind of make films where the frame is animated and constantly shifting shape, and sort of a bit like in a classic animation that we probably have all taught, those of us who've taught film intro classes at Roehampton, in Duck Amuck, the Daffy Duck animation where the frame keeps collapsing in on the image. I sort of wanted, I keep wanting to do something where I can animate the frame and have it constantly kind of mutating and shifting. And I know that I can do it in a kind of primitive way, but I need to build up the technical skills to be able to do it in the kind of, in a much more sophisticated way that I would like to. And I wonder that actually, you know, what needs to come in from the outside of the frame doesn't need to be black leader, but it can be all sorts of things, including footage from other films. And then to have these films bursting or seeping through these frames and getting, like when you drop ink into water, a kind of like bleed, which I think is also kind of there in nascent form in what's referred to as the data mosh, which is also a form that I've both written about and tried to work through. So for me, I think, you know, what could happen, and it might end up looking a bit like one of two things. I mean, one film that I would love to be able to make is a kind of a film that, if you've ever seen those sort of images, which are basically images that are composed of thousands of micro images. So you have like, and it's a very commercial example, but when those slightly crappy Star Wars prequels came out back in the early 2000s, I think the posters for those featured an image of like Obi-Wan Kenobi, but if you looked at it, it was comprised of hundreds of images from the film. And I would like to make films that are every frame of the film at once, but which compose to be the film also in a kind of sequence. But then to kind of get rid of the borders between those and to have the film become a kind of an Orpik soup of just color fleshing around. And so what might look eventually a bit like those visualizations that you get of like a whole film in one image, where it's just this kind of like band of color across our visual frame, moving from left to right and so on. But to turn that into a kind of a moving format as opposed to just this kind of still visualizations of that. So it would be something that heads towards something kind of very abstract. Then where would it kind of play? You know, I would need to think about that. I find it's so, I made a film that was about stops on the Central Line, and it had a wonderful screening that I remember you attending, Mike, in Liverpool Street, in Thingy Market. Which one was it in? What's the market? Liverpool Street.
Yeah.
Spitalfields, exactly. In Spitalfields Market. But I wanted that film to play on in a space where there would be one screen per tube stop, so that you could basically do a lap of London on the Circle Line as a way of watching the film. But everyone that I spoke to was kind of like, oh, it'll cost you a fortune. Even kind of gallery space was kind of like, no, if you need to get that number of TVs in, that costs loads. Like, and so there's real barriers to kind of like, oh yeah, I want to do something that has like 45 different screens and a space and so on. These require so much kind of time and effort that it's kind of like, oh, I'll just stick to, because I'm really impatient, I just kind of like want to carry on doing stuff, and it's kind of like, I want to get on to the next project. I don't want to have to spend kind of like forever on this one. You know, you just kind of like settle for one screen and go from there.
Many thanks. So
thank you.
Caro, shall I, I'm not sure how you want to do it in terms of kind of inviting, or how we're going to manage questions.
Sure. Thank you so much for both so very much for such a really rich, intriguing, deeply thought-provoking conversation. My mind is reeling in so many different directions, as it often is when I hear either of you speak, and to hear both of you together is quite something to kind of process in a kind of a mental level, I think. I wanted to, if it's not too much of an imposition in my role as chair, just to kind of flag something that comes to mind in response to Mike's question about audiovisual film philosophy, and Will's response around this extraordinary idea of, I suppose, taking film out of its place and into some as yet to be identified mode of experience. And it just got me thinking about thinking, and the way in which each of these films has reminded me, you won't be surprised to hear, of various different psychoanalytic concepts. And I was very much thinking about film as a transformational object in one sense, but also about the territory of the filmic space in each of these works as relating to physical space that we can recognize and have memories of, and that, you know, the function of both Golden Gate Bridge and the various sculptures and sculpture of London set landmarks in which we map our own sense of self, or our own sense of relation to time, history, ideology, power, hegemony, disruptions of all of the above. And so the scope, the ideas of potential space and transformational, transitional space come to mind. But most importantly, what I was thinking about was what Wilfred Bion describes in terms of the function of thinking. And the function of thinking is really as a form of metabolizing experience. And for me, what both of your films did and continue to do is to enable me to metabolize the experience of everything that is signified in the work, and everything in each of the works, and everything that it reminds me of. And the other thinker that comes to mind in this context is Christopher Bollas, who recently has, and Will, I think you might be interested in this, in his book Meaning and Melancholia, which is deceptively short. He writes about his notion of the transmissive object, which he applies to both the form of technology and also to the subject engaging with technology, so that not only does the technological object transmit experience, meaning, and possibility, but then we become engaged in a kind of constant relay with that object, and therefore become transmissive subjects/objects ourselves. And I think all of this has been brought to mind for me. I can speak more to you about it if it's at all of interest, but I just wanted to put it on record while it's in my mind. So apologies for jumping in as chair. We do have quite a few questions in the chat, and I can currently see one hand raised. So I think if it's okay, we'll start with the first question that came in quite some time ago from Michael Godard. Michael, I'm not sure if you're there, and if so, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question yourself, but if not, I'm very happy to take it from the chat.
Yeah, partly it just occurred to me during the conversation, and then I think Michael and Will kind of already discussed around this sort of, you know, not only marker, but also the Varda and Godard and so forth. And also I have to, I mean, I was at a kind of a job interview, so I missed the first screening. I've had a little bit of a look at it, which looks fabulous, and it sort of, you know, sort of it incorporated that part of Sans Soleil, and you know, the sort of the so-called insane memory part, and you know, it sort of had a sense of, you know, insane futurity. But I'll limit my question to the relationship, you know, because you invoke The Statues Also Die by Marker and René in the Statues of London, and it seemed to me like almost like this was a sort of a kind of a sequel in a sense. But one thing that what I wanted to ask about was the sort of you know, the kind of the effective tone, because I just The Statues Also Die is a film that I kind of read about a lot, and I basically knew what it was about, but I hadn't really experienced it. But I actually showed it in a documentary class, and what kind of really struck me about it is that, like, this is like a really angry film. You know, it's like really it's really confronting the, you know, the average French viewer who's just sort of consuming all the sort of African art and so forth, with what, you know, where those things come from and how their meanings are being kind of destroyed and so forth. And I just wonder if you comment on the difference of the tone between your film and that film, because in a sense you're confronting, you know, not identical things, but perhaps similar things. And, you know, I think there's some reference mentioned before about the more recent kind of, you know, sort of contestation around statuary and, you know, slave ownership and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to say something about the, you know, the kind of tone that you adopted in the film, where, you know, I sort of sense that, you know, there are moments where it does seem like there is some kind of, you know, anger there, perhaps, at the form that a lot of your statues take, and the glorification of, you know, war and empire and so forth.
I mean, I think this is a very great set of observations and a good question. I think you very much got what I was trying to do with Insane Memory in the Golden Gate film. Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, I wonder that melancholy is in some ways a kind of tone that is sort of at work in both pieces in some ways, but in the statues one, maybe a kind of, yeah, I don't know why I didn't think I couldn't just rip these statues down. Like I you know, there's something in me that is like too accepting of their existence, that should really probably have just been like, do you know what? They're cold, they're unwelcoming, they often kind of don't really, you know, it's not that yeah, maybe I don't really like seeing a good chunk of them. You know, I just find it sort of alienating to see a lot of these pieces of work of art. But I'm too caught up in kind of like my, you know, accepting, subjugated sort of Britishness, which, you know, Michael, you fortunately not to suffer from, you know, whereby I sort of don't think that, you know, I don't think I can tear these things down, and maybe I should have I should also be invested in that. You know, I have conversations, you know, my family are kind of like, oh, I don't like what they're doing in Bristol with these statues, or, you know, in Johannesburg or wherever it may be, and I'm just, I don't feel the same way. I'm going like, well, no, you know, it's a statue, you know, who cares, like, particularly. And I am kind of like on board, I guess, with these sort of more radical gestures, if they qualify as radical at all. So yeah, maybe I should have been a bit more radical. I think it's there sort of formally in the film as well. You know, I wanted the film to be very accessible. It's not, I think I could have done so much more formally with kind of making the statues weirder, with kind of making the montage less accessible. But I suppose I was thinking about a kind of, you know, a sort of a regular non-academic audience in some ways, even if it tends towards the academic. So I didn't want to make a film itself that was too alienating, but that just kind of nudged us in the position of acknowledging something and rethinking it. You know, perhaps sort of got some thinking going rather than called for the destruction of these things, but maybe I should rethink that. I think it's a good point. I mean, with regards specifically to the Statues Also Die, I have a tendency when I know that a film has basically inspired a film that I'm making. So I mentioned a film, Circle Line, earlier, which is very much a kind of synthesis in my mind of Le Joli Mai by Marker and what's that Jean Roche Edgar Morin film, Un Chronique d'un été, Chronicle of the Summer. I sort of specifically don't watch those films again, because otherwise I'll probably be trying too hard to kind of replicate some of. I prefer to just go off my kind of remembered version of these things. So I have seen Statues Also Die, but I haven't seen it for a few years, and I specifically didn't want to see it again in case it kind of influenced me too much. But I'm glad, and I look forward to watching it again, actually, to remember how angry it was, because I think it would be nice to have that refresher.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Question?
Great answers.
Thanks. Jonathan Skinner, Johnny, sorry. Would you like to, I see you have a comment, would you like to speak to it?
Yeah, no, thank you. And just to say hi, and it's great to be sort of further stimulated by you, and we miss you, and yeah, it's great seeing people from the former Roehampton, as is very poignant today. But it's great to see the best of Roehampton here as well in this. It was just really reacting to the Golden Gates and the video essay part, and the use of Baudrillard on the disaster movies as rehearsals, and it just got me thinking. I'm working on writing about the island of Montserrat in the Caribbean. It's been struck by volcanic eruptions, and a lot of people are visiting it, and it's just been used as a sort of landscape backdrop for the sort of post-apocalyptic film Wendy, and it's interesting seeing that when the tourists are visiting the site, they're actually thinking of the films, and they're also having a sort of rehearsal maybe on their own mortality as dark tourists. So it was just really more of a comment than a sort of question. That the film becomes a sort of projection in their minds, and it was just interesting playing around with the disaster movie, the movie and the reality, and the reality becomes sort of overladen by the actual movie itself. And then I put in a little link about the sort of jumpers and Golden Gates, which is really interesting, and it's very dramatic as a suicide performance to some extent, compared with other sort of going to Dignitas, for example, which sort of contrasts. So it's just really a comment on those relations. But thank you, really stimulating.
Thank you. You look very much like Jean-Luc Godard with the kind of backlighting behind you when he's sort of editing stuff in his movies. I mean, I haven't seen Wendy. I've seen Beasts of the Southern Wild, so I would hope in some ways that it's as interesting a film with regard to its kind of racial politics, I guess. I mean, it strikes me that thinking about Montserrat must be full of, I mean, if it's called dark tourism, you know, Montserrat carries a Caribbean, you know, history of slavery and so on, and I think it's sort of something that perhaps I don't quite get across in Golden Gate. It's that this sort of end of the world experience, this sort of apocalyptic experience, you know, is one that happened centuries ago for indigenous peoples and for those involved in the Middle Passage, you know, into these kinds of spaces. And so there is something kind of very Eurocentric and Blanco-centric about this kind of like fascination with the end of the world and the way in which it's located with these, I guess in the case of Montserrat in particular, these sort of particular places. I really look forward to having a look at the piece about the Golden Gate jumpers. Those images are taken from a film called The Bridge, and I think in a couple of cases anyway, there's something very, very performative about the jumps, particularly the main guy who we see, who kind of bears this kind of weird resemblance to the guy that made The Room, whose name suddenly escapes me. And you know, with the sort of arms out and the jump and so on. So, you know, there is, I mean, there's so much to kind of get through in terms of how we could understand that, and on so many different levels, psychologically and so on. But I look forward to thinking more about it. Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you. I think we have our very own Dr. McIver here. Gillian, would you like to speak to your comment?
Hi there. Yes, my comment is not a question, it's a comment, because I just wanted to say I was interested at the beginning of the talk when you started talking about the idea of the potential problem with a really academic voice in making films which are essentially, you know, do have something to say and want to actually explore a subject in that way. But I thought that your narrative structure worked really well. I really appreciated the way in which it started out with this sort of, you know, almost so I'm going to tell you something, that moved quite smoothly into a very reflective mode, and then into quite a poetic, and then it shifted into the political. And I felt that the shifts were very subtle, and it wasn't until sort of after it was over that I really felt the impact of what I'd seen. And so I just really wanted to say that I liked your narrative structure really very much. And I thought the cinematography was wonderful.
Thank you. And I will definitely pass on to Tom about his cinematography. He's available to hire, any filmmakers out there. I know he's worked with Paul Antic a wee bit as well. And everyone should watch Paul's recent Smith films, they're fabulous. But I think that kind of, just to sort of maybe say one thing, that kind of approach to writing text, I'm constantly seeking to do that in my academic writing that's published under my name, or on the odd occasion that I publish under someone else's name, the kind of in that kind of way, because for better or for worse, and I can understand how this might run contrary to some people's feelings about what is or should be happening within academia at the moment, but I feel that there's so much depersonalization. I feel that there's so much, and we're supposed not to take anything personally, and yet this work dominates our lives, and it kind of is our lives. I feel that actually these shifts of register from the academic to the poetic to the political should be there in our work, and that part of decolonizing the academy, this thing that supposedly we're all invested in at this point in time, you know, is really insincere if we don't allow for the kind of decolonization of discourses through the kind of mixing of these registers and so on. That's my understanding of it, and I'm sure that it has its own limitations and problems, and it would be good, but it would be good to be having dialogues about that, I think, because you know, I feel this, for want of a better generalization, the sort of scientification of the humanities is killing its humanity.
Fully agree with you. Thank you.
And with thanks for your patience, I think Professor Channon, you're next in the list.
Thank you. Hello, William, and everybody else. And thanks very much for the films, both of which I enjoyed immensely. And it's a very rich discussion, so I'll try and focus down, although I wanted to say that I quite agreed with the last comment about the narrative structure of the London film. But the question I have really is about the tensions of filming a city, which you and I have both done in the case of London, but also in other cases. And the difference that it makes when the viewer knows the city and doesn't. Because what I found about your London film, if I can call it that, is that it started by, I mean, I think watching a film of your own city is also always extremely challenging, because, you know, you want to recognize your own city and not to be, you know, too discombobulated by the image of it, but also to learn something, perhaps, right? Okay, so for me, model films of London would include Patrick Keeler's film, and they'd include William Raeburn's film about sailing down the Thames. And what happened in this one was that it started off giving me a sense of recognition at the same time as directing me towards the things that I knew, of course. But it then progressed in this fashion that's been described, to reveal the city that I know and have always had a kind of love-hate relationship with, in a very fresh and quite provocative manner. The only doubt that I have in your comments that you've been making have to do with what you're seeing, what we're seeing at the end, when you get to the question and the role of abstract sculptures. Because I remember on my first visit to Chicago being absolutely stunned by the sculptures in the street. But then I have to reflect that while they make that, make it such an exciting city to be in visually, they also coexist perfectly well with finance capital and the rest of it. So where's the challenge?
This is a good question.
Could I add a question about the Golden Gate film, which is a bit cheeky, really. First of all, I thought that it was very wittily put together. There are several points at which I laughed out loud. It made me think of a conversation I had decades ago with the composer Harrison Birtwistle about a chamber opera he'd composed on Punch and Judy, which was extremely violent. And Harry Birtwistle, like you, is a very gentle person. What is it that drives people like you to want to put together all of that violent material, and what do you feel when you're doing it?
Two good questions. I mean, I think in relation to finance capital, and I thought you were going to talk about Anish Kapoor's Cloud Beam, or whatever it's called in Chicago, as this kind of like central piece of work. And itself, much as I like Kapoor, perhaps a kind of very corporate piece of artwork. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I don't really explore, and I think it's a good point, well made. But it's to do with the kind of the provenance of a lot of these artworks. You know, some of these more abstract pieces are sat outside the offices of, you know, corporate entities, and I sort of say that these works, not least because they have reflective surfaces, in some ways invite us to think about what we see in them, as well as them themselves as objects. And in this sense, they're inviting us to think about their surroundings. And in that process, we might wrestle a little bit of subversion. They are trying to get us to feel about this space, and this space could be a very corporate space, but then we can identify it as corporate and identify the corporateness of it as such, and not therefore accept it as is. But is that what really happens? I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I think that this is also the gamut that artists the world over, you know, have to face, or the gamble that they have, or the whatever, you know, the challenge that they must face, because they possibly as artists want to be subversive in some respect, and yet as people who need to put food in their mouths, they have to take the jobs that they're offered. So, you know, maybe that's in some ways an irresolvable-ish sort of tension. Maybe those sculptures could be ripped down as well. You know, for me, I think the best one, and oddly enough, it's made by my cinematographer's father. Tom Mayne's cinematographer, John Mayne, is the artist who made the arena on the Southbank. I sort of keep coming back to that. I'm sure it's a corporate piece of work in the sense that whoever, Southwark Council or whoever it may be that commissioned it, you know, but it's a very public piece of work, and people are, you wouldn't even think of it as a sculpture, and I don't even know if it qualifies as sculpture technically, whatever that means, but people sit on it, people climb on it, play on it, and for me that's, corporate or not, its usage I think becomes, you know, my favorite kind of usage for these sorts of works of art. You know, it's very tactile, and I would like to see more of that in some ways. You know, the ants get to crawl on these statues, but humans don't, and yet, you know, why the hell aren't we arresting the ants for crawling all over these things? And with regard to Golden Gate, yeah, how do I feel? I mean, it's supposed to be, and I felt it today watching it again. You know, it's like it's relentless, that first half, and it really pushes you to be kind of like, Jesus, how much violence is there in you know, in all these films that we watch, and then it's supposed to kind of like shift, and I suppose I want to push people a little bit so that the shift becomes more pronounced. And even though I kind of even though I say so myself, like probably Golden Gate is the one film that I've made that makes me cry when I watch it, and it kind of did today. I just appreciating that other people might see me doing so, I kind of held them back, but it's definitely made me cry in the past. I don't know if it's, I can't speak for other people, but you know, in that sense, I think that the kind of relentless violence does end up having this kind of quite affective power, for me anyway, and I guess I can only go by that as my kind of guide as a filmmaker. It's not the only thing I can go by, but I'm going to trust myself in some ways that you know does you know that's why it's kind of like there is to produce this effect. I mean, with regard to your reading of my personality, Michael, I'm, you know, my dented filing cabinet in my office, and you know the door that was broken off my chest of drawers in my office surely bespeak how I'm not always placid, and that certain frustrations can have to be, you know, find their ways out in less publicly performative fashions than that. But so maybe my engagement with violence isn't all that, isn't so but Wisselian, but we'll see.
Perhaps now tempered by your engagement with therapy, one would hope.
I'm not sure whether that
That's right.
Harry Birtwistle gave me. He just laughed and looked embarrassed.
Thanks to both. Yeah. We have about 8 minutes or so left of the official runtime for this event, and Enrica has been waiting very patiently. So it's lovely to see you, Enrica. Now is your moment. You need to unmute. Enrica, you need to unmute.
Okay, here we go again. I said I'll be very brief because I'm very aware of time passing by. But so first of all, I just wanted to say how glad I am to see William again, and we do miss you very much, and how much I enjoyed the work, and in particular Golden Gate, which actually I thought it was extremely well, it worked extremely well, it was extremely well edited, and was a really interesting balance of a playfulness. And by playfulness, I also mean playing with concepts in a sense, but also the kind of video game kind of going back to that violence now is expressed in the video, so that kind of language in a sense, and very sophisticated erudite kind of use So the coexistence of those, I think it made, for me, really one of the strengths of the film, not beyond what he's saying, of course, which is very interesting, but in terms of language, I mean, so that kind of co-presence of what we might, you know, what we perceive being low language, which is the language of video games and all that kind of, so very adolescent kind of language in a sense, and the very erudite use of, you know, what actually you're using to play with that language. I thought that was extremely interesting. A lot has been said on bridges and metaphors and so on. So I wanted just to touch on one aspect of the bridge, in a sense, which hasn't actually been touched upon, and which actually struck to me as I was watching this first part as one of the things that it kept provoking as a thought, which is, if we look at the bridge, in a sense, is one of the pinnacles of human ingenuity. I mean, it's engineering and kind of the kind of mastering the relationship, the power relationship between human and nature, by which he kind of joins two things which nature has aside are separate, for instance, like by a river or by the sea and so on. And so, and, you know, with a kind of all this ingenuity and somehow some of the forces of distractions are, yes, these aliens, X-Files and so on, but a lot of them comes from nature. So whether be animals of what sorts of mythological or whatever, the waves and so on. And so I just felt that there was actually in that kind of discourse of the end of and whatever, apocalyptic and possibly the beginning of something else, was not, for me, was beyond the end of the white Western civilization and the entrance, because that has happened maybe kind of, hopefully, not entirely, but has been happening already. But it was kind of really the gate of the next kind of step, which might be the end of us as human beings, you know, that kind of balance between human and nature, and how much we might have overstepped our ingenuity and become really self-destructive in a sense, and unleashed the dark violence of nature, which is sort of kind of answering back somehow. So I wonder if there is anything that, as we were choosing all these elements between the apes and this and that, you know, and the octopuses and the whatever, there are all sorts of animals, yeah.
I mean, I think that's a very good question. I suppose I'd respond in a couple of ways. One, for me, in my kind of theoretical thinking, I can plug some future work here. Lockdown, kind of, and my compulsive typing led to quite a lot of writing in the last kind of year or so. So I have a book coming out on Buster Keaton, posthumanism and critical race theory, and then a kind of sequel to the Squid book on streaming shows like Stranger Things, Watchmen, Lovecraft Country, the OA, Devs, and various other things, which is also kind of about squids, octopuses, and also race. So, and a lot of people, one of the key writings recently on Buster Keaton's work is by a scholar called Jennifer Fay, who did a book about the Anthropocene in relation to cinema. And one of the points that she makes, which I think is a good one, is that what we regularly think of as being natural disasters and sort of somehow just inevitably happening are anything but, and that actually a lot of these disasters, including desertification, you know, are the result of human intervention in the planet. So, you know, we can think about, and it's implied in a lot of the films. It's like, oh, what brings about Godzilla? Oh, it's the nuclear sort of tests underwater in Bikini Atoll and these kinds of things. So what seems to be the kind of the natural is the natural as shaped by the human. And I think it couldn't be any other way in some ways, because there is only entanglement between these things. And so our relationship with nature isn't one of restoration to some sort of nature from which we're divorced, but it is about kind of politics and questions of sort of domination and willpower and so on. So for me, I think that's essential to be, or that's a kind of a key way to be think about these things, is that, you know, let us not sort of fetishize nature too much as such. And the other is, I think we shouldn't fetishize the human too much as such. Or what I would say by that is, within critical race theory, and I'm thinking primarily of someone like Sylvia Wynter, as well as other scholars in her wake, you know, have argued, I think, quite powerfully that the human, as defined by modernity, so since first contact of Columbus in 1492 and intensified through industrialization and perhaps even continuing in the post-industrial era, is that the human has been defined as the white, in effect, kind of white patriarchal masculinity and so on. And that in particular the black, but not only the black, has been consigned to an inhuman realm or a subhuman realm. And this is Winter's legacy, I guess, for me, is most excitingly put forward recently by another scholar of color called Zakia Iman-Jackson, who writes about the plasticity of blackness. So for her, the idea isn't that blacks are inhuman, it's also the blacks are kind of like superhuman in popular culture, as well as in the sort of the Western mindset. And so there's a plasticity or a softness or a malleability to blackness, which is there, as well as other non-white or you know, forms, if form is the right word for it. So I think that I think that when we sort of talk about the post-human, it's really that the language in and of itself betrays a kind of a particular conception of the human, which has always excluded non-white others, and perhaps other others as well. And so, yes, there is a kind of post-human advent or arrival or arrivance in a kind of Derrida language of the arrivant, of the kind of the stranger, taken up in the Discourse of Hyperobjects by Timothy Morton, and these kinds of engagements with the natural world. But you know, there's always these racial political histories at work within them. There's in effect always capital at work within them. So I basically agree with you, but I also think that, you know, and maybe that's part of what's hopeful about it, but it's not like they can eradicate these histories.
No.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was just curious what was, because I could feel there was a kind of tact there, but I just wanted to explore a little bit more your own, you know, not my own taking of it, but your own thinking of it when you were making it. And then that makes all sense. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I just saw Tina's Queen Elizabeth Park. I don't think I have seen, I must have seen Reaching Out, but it suddenly struck me that there's the one sculpture which is in the film, which is the one in the roundabout in Stockwell, which has the woman with her baby, but I will look it up. It's a great recommendation.
Thanks so much. I'm aware that we're very, very slightly over time, and I'm aware that William especially has used his voice hugely for the last few hours. But I wondered if Mike and William would like to say anything in conclusion before we bring this to a close, this official kind of recorded section at least to a close. Is there anything either of you would like to add?
I would just like to say it's just been a pleasure to see you and to talk to you, William. And I would just, you know, just really wholeheartedly recommend that other people check out some of your other films that we've, you know, some of the titles that we've mentioned during the talk. I watched for the first time recently This Is Cinema, which I think is a mini masterpiece. So I can only recommend it to everyone. I'm not sure if it's, you know, where it's been published or if it's available, but I do think it's a wonderful, very low budget feature film that features many students from Roehampton and staff from Roehampton and is set in and around Roehampton. So at the very least, maybe when we're back on campus, we should organise a screening there.
Yeah, definitely. I haven't seen that one. Send us a link.
I think my headphones have died. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're still there.
Let me. I have to go through the. Can you?
Yes.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
I hear you.
This of these headphones died. Mike, that's very kind of you to say. I mean, This is Cinema got very close to being accepted into the London Film Festival, which I think would have given it a life also beyond the London Film Festival. I got some very positive feedback, but ultimately a kind of like, oh, I'm sorry, we can't program it. And then a kind of very encouraging, but I look forward to seeing where it plays on the festival circuit after this. Because I have to fund all of these things myself, I can afford like one festival submission a month or so, and I've just had blanket rejection since. But a couple of people recently have said, oh, they think it should be on like Mubi or somewhere. So it's very kind of people to say. So, I mean, I'll happily share it with you, but I'm not sure that it will have any life whatsoever. Alas, it's a kind of a dead baby in some ways. But and I will see from that into a live baby perhaps in a few minutes. But the just to clarify that it's not set at the University of Roehampton. Filmed there. And it may seem like it's set at the University of Roehampton. Definitely not set at the University of Roehampton.
Wonderfully observed. Perfect timing as ever. I'd like to just invite our remaining audience members to express their appreciation. You have some reaction options on your screen, and you might want to unmute and give a warm round of applause. It's been a really, really, really excellent, rich session. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.